Good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're watching from. My name is Arleen Westerhof, and welcome to this Thinking Beyond Moria Towards Long-Term Strategies for Migration Symposium, organized by the Scientific Institute of the Christian Union Political Party in the Netherlands, the Economic Summit, and SALUX. Thank you for joining us. This symposium is meant to help to catalyze the discussion around migration to Europe and to work towards developing shared perspectives and long-term solutions in this area. Now, today you're going to hear several presentations. The first will be given by Laurens Wijmenga and will focus on the dilemmas that staff of relief and development organizations face when it comes to providing aid to migrants and to potential migrants. I will give the second presentation, and I'm going to focus on the situation on the ground in Africa. In my presentation, I will examine the question, what will it take to provide Africans, and especially the next generation of Africans, with hope in the future of their nations so that they don't feel that they have to migrate? And then after that, we're going to have a short 5-minute break before going into our third presentation, which will be given by our keynote speaker, Luc Gnacadja. And Luc is based in Benin, and he will focus on debunking some of the myths around migration. And also, he will look at some of the environmental push factors for migration. And this is also done with the aim to help us to make a more accurate diagnosis of the causes and to come up with more effective responses and solutions. And after all of these presentations, our two guest panelists here with us in the studio, Minella van Bergeijk and also Joël Voordewind, will give their responses. Each of the speakers today will be introduced before they speak. And at the end of it all, this will be followed by a question and answer session. Now, during the presentations, we invite you to send your questions and your comments to us via the YouTube reply function. Now, before I begin, I want to stress on behalf of the organizing committee of this event that we do not see this symposium as providing all of the answers. Instead, we want to approach this very, very complex topic with humility, and we invite you to join the discussion. I now have the pleasure of introducing Laurens Wijmenga to you. And Laurens is one of the organizers of this event, and he's an associate at the Scientific Institute of the Christian Union. And in this capacity, he participates in publications and debates. Laurens studied economics at the University of Utrecht, and in addition to his work at the Scientific Institute, he's also a senior researcher at the Court of Auditors of Rotterdam. Today, Laurens will present a research paper on the subject of the European migration and development policy. Laurens, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Arleen. Thank you for the introduction. And I will start my presentation with a picture. I hope it works. This is for many people a disturbing yet familiar image from last year. The fire at the Moria refugee camp in Greece, on the Greek island of Lesbos. And migration has been one of the most important topics that affected European voters for the last few years. Today, however, I do not want to talk about current events, but about a long-term strategy for migration. That's what my research, of which I present the preliminary conclusions today, is about. For this research paper, I used a practice-oriented research approach. I have held interviews with 20 staff of NGOs, relief and development organizations, and asked them the following two questions. What dilemmas do they face when providing aid to potential migrants, and what solutions do they see? And also, what ideas do they have for the European migration policy? And their answers inspired me to what I call a good story about migration, about the European migration policy. And anyone who focuses on the root causes of migration, that's my proposition, must focus on a just order. A few remarks before I start. I have made a very strict distinction between emergency relief and between development work, such as in the countries of origin of migrants. But I, of course, recognize that these are different practices. And the NGOs involved in this research provide both emergency relief and were involved in development. And the second remark is that the views I represent in this research are not necessarily of the NGOs themselves, but merely of the interviewees, the staff of the NGOs I interviewed, unless I stated otherwise. The third remark is today I will present an abstract of a paper. And if you want to receive the full paper, you can email me, and you can find my email address on the Scientific Institute website, or just reply on the confirmation mail for this event. A final report is published in May 2021, and you can. And I look forward to your comments, and I hope we will succeed in developing a shared perspective on migration. Let me start first with the first question of my research, the dilemmas, and the interviewed staff named 3, and they all have to deal with the root causes of migration. The first dilemma is how to prevent emergency situations like on Lesbos from being maintained by providing relief to migrants. And this dilemma takes different forms. For example, on the Greek islands, the authorities do not seem willing to really improve the situation on the ground there. They might even be pleased with the situation there. And some NGOs therefore considered to leave the island to force the authorities to leave to really improve the situation. But on the other hand, aid workers also noted if the government would really improve the situation on the ground, that would undoubtedly lead to many more migrants crossing to Lesbos. But the interviewed staff members also encountered this dilemma in other forms in the countries of origin. For example, conflicts, they often turn out to last for decades or return every year again. So how will you continue to provide emergency aid? How long will you continue doing that? And how do you prevent people from becoming dependent on aid? And another dilemma is, especially in countries like Syria, where the government that causes the conflict there is still there, the government. And if you want to do development and reconstruction in these countries, you will have to work closely with this government. And the question is, are NGOs, are they willing to do that or not? Well, the second dilemma has to do with how migration is seen. And in many European countries, there's an electoral shift visible towards right-wing parties that want to curb migration. And this leads to a migration policy that focuses on curbing and controlling migration, such as the recent European Pact on Migration and Asylum, of which many NGOs and their staff are very critical. And their main criticism includes restriction of the operations of humanitarian organizations, such as the search and rescue missions on the Mediterranean Sea, but also the lack of European cooperation in the distribution of asylum seekers, and the extension of the period for migrants' detention on the borders of Europe. And besides, and that's a major point for the many staff members I interviewed, the root causes of migration are much deeper. And migration is often a result of problems that Europe contributed to. And for example, the arms trade, the climate change, and unjust macroeconomic relations. And many staff members said that these problems are not addressed sufficiently by European nations. And in line with this migration policy, the European Council and individual European countries allocate a substantial part of their development money to budget to projects that are aimed at combating migration. And they also attach conditions to receiving aid, for example, taking back migrants who were refused asylum. And this was discussed in December last year extensively, following the endorsement of the Neighbourhood Development and International Cooperation Instruments. And the picture shows how many of the NGOs see this program as a sort of wall built with aid to prevent migration. The dilemma for NGOs is, do you want to receive funding from this grant program aimed at preventing migration? And the third and final dilemma has to do with the scale and the complexity of the root causes of migration, and those are poverty and conflicts. Which approach really works? And some development workers long for some kind of Marshall Plan, and this refers to the large-scale reconstruction plan of the United States of America that funded our reconstruction after the Second World War. But at the same time, they recognized that the success of the original Marshall Plan depended on very specific conditions that are not met in countries of origin of migrants. For example, a well-educated population, well-working institutions, well-working governments, and the protection provided by the US military. And moreover, many Christian NGOs say that the rationale of upscaling, which is of course the rationale of the Marshall Plan, upscaling aid, stems from a technical, or you might say a neoliberal worldview that reduces the issue of development to efficiency, capital, and techniques. And besides, the German Marshall Plan, which is the screenshot you can see on the screen, is about. And also similar initiatives, they did not go much further than the drawing board, because funds were often lacking, and also because politicians from Africa generally see it as a one-sided Western initiative. So far, the interviews did not seem to offer very much inspiration for a good, hopeful story about migration, although so it seems. But on the other hand, acknowledging dilemmas honestly does not have to lead to pessimism. And the conversations with staff of NGOs also provided some hopeful insights that I want to share with you. The first hopeful insight is that we all share some ethical standards. And the interviewed staff often refer to human rights, specifically the UN Refugee Convention, both as an ethical reference, but also as a source of inspiration. And this convention states that refugees deserve protection and should be sent back to the countries where they can fear persecution. And the recent survey of the people of 26 rich countries in May 2020 on World Refugee Day shows that globally most people uphold that standard, even though they're not very optimistic about the chance of refugees integrating successfully in their own societies. And in most European countries, an even higher percentage support the right to take refugees, to take refuge. So this is a hopeful insight, I think. The second hopeful insight is that although staff of NGOs are very critical of some aspects of the European development policy and the migration policy, they still support the main priorities of both policies. And when it comes to development policy, these include, for example, the structural approach to poverty, the promotion of human rights, and also the role of the civil society, which mainly Christian NGOs emphasize often. And when it comes to migration policy, these include preventing irregular migration, which many NGO staff called a dark form of migration, improving reception in the region of asylum seekers, and returning rejected asylum seekers, and also promoting legal migration routes to Europe. Well, where the path of NGOs and politicians really seem to separate is the perspective they use. NGOs often use the perspective of the migrants and of migrant communities, and politicians of their constituents. And politicians argue then that many migrants have economic motives to migrate. And some of the staff do not want to judge this in principle. They say, well, they have come for a reason, and they first of all want to see a migrant as a person who needs help. However, there are also shared perspectives here, because staff who did judge the motives of migrants say that physical security, for example, the threat of war, of persecution by a regime, as a motive to migrate is only relevant for a very small minority of migrants. Above all, migrants, even from countries like Syria, are fleeing countries where basic services are no longer functioning, partly because of Western sanctions in the case of Syria, and where it is very difficult to make ends meet. Moreover, and this is the third hopeful insight, both migration-critical politicians and staff of NGOs value community. But let me first comment on the two pictures you can see on the screen. The left one is a picture of the Dutch NGO Cordate that coined the phrase or the term building flourishing communities as their mission statements. And the second one on the right is of the European Commission. It's visualized their strategic priority that is called promoting the European way of life. And this priority involves the earlier mentioned Migration Pact, but also the protection of human rights and the rule of law in Europe. And according to many politicians, the boundaries of the national community, where human rights are protected and the rule of law is protected, these boundaries come under pressure from globalization. And migration is the most visible effect of globalization. And this leads to uncertainty about the cultural identity of communities, of European communities, and their means of subsistence. But employees of NGOs also recognize that people thrive best in the communities they come from. They do not leave those communities until their safety is threatened or material needs are not met. So, employees of NGOs and politicians seem to find each other around the goal of allowing both European communities and the communities that send migrants out to flourish, and thus address the root causes of migration and hopefully also the polarization in the debate on migration. But how can we do that? What strategy should Europe and European countries pursue? Well, the answer can be summarized, I think, by the following statement. A long-term strategy for migration should focus on a just world order. And this strategy should consist of a few building blocks, of which you can see the first one on the screen already. And these building blocks are inspired by my research, but also by previous research by the Scientific Institute and major Christian thinkers like the American theologian and foreign policy advisor Reinhold Niebuhr. And the first building block of a just order is a more balanced European migration policy that not only protects the European way of life, but also pays sufficient attention to the interests of the migrants and the communities that send them out. And several interviewees noted that the focus of the EU is now too much on controlling migration, and too much focus on administrative control, I learned from the interviews, but also from my own research and earlier research, can ultimately lead to inhumane situations. For example, the pushbacks of boats with migrants in the Mediterranean Sea. In terms of aid to migrants and communities, a lot of good is already happening. According to many interviewees, more attention should be paid to creating awareness of the risks of irregular migration. And the interviews revealed also a very innovative idea in this regard, namely involving the diasporas of migrants in Europe, both for aid and also for creating awareness, because these diasporas often have knowledge about and connections in the countries of origin of migrants, and also speak the language, of course. Finally, I think there's a case for the demand that partner countries cooperate with EU migration policies as a condition for receiving aid. After all, European countries also have to look out for the interests of their own communities. The second building block of a just order is a more robust European foreign policy. And many staff of NGOs noted that as long as armed conflicts continue, millions of migrants cannot return home and have no real perspective. Most of them are received in neighboring countries, and there they have no access to the labor market or to the housing market. And in many countries, they do not even have a perspective on citizenship. For example, in Lebanon, which did not sign the UN Refugee Convention, the refugees there do not have any perspective on getting citizenship there in the future. And the best solution for NGO staff said for them is to return home, of course. But because of the economic and security problems, and these are often intertwined, that is not possible. And first, these problems should be addressed. And let me start with the problem of armed conflicts. I think political means should first be employed to resolve conflicts, such as sanctions or resolutions condemning the parties. But sometimes military power or the credible threat with it is also needed. Consider, for example, NATO's action in Kosovo. That's also almost 22 years ago at this day, which successfully ended the refugee crisis there. And to describe Dutch foreign policy, the metaphor of the merchant and the vicar is often used, and the merchant stands for our trade interests, and the vicar stands for our commitment to human rights. But for a just order, however, also the soldier is needed. We need to increase both our budget for development aid, which hovers around 0.7% at this time, and for defense, which is a little higher. After all, the saying goes, those who want to build peace have to prepare for war. I will not go into the complexities of the legitimate mandate here and the respective tasks of the nation state, the EU and the NATO. But the bottom line is that European countries need to increase the defense spending to wield more geopolitical influence and ultimately promote the peace and security in conflict zones close to Europe. That's not to say that we now have to march off to war for human rights and democracy, of course, but because one of the major lessons of the last decades is, for example, in Iraq and Libya, is that military interventions can also backfire and create an escalation of violence. And the distinction between larger and smaller evils in this regard is not easy to make. And with Reinhold Niebuhr, the foreign policy advisor I mentioned earlier, I conclude that the ideal of justice is best served by a pragmatic foreign policy. And that is the third building block. A pragmatic foreign policy means restraint on one hand in interfering in foreign conflicts, but if we choose to do so, we should not shy away from making dirty hands. For example, several employees of NGOs are calling for a rethink of the sanctions against Syria and the creation of safe areas in Syria where NGOs can start rebuilding. So refugees can ultimately return home. And this might involve making concessions to Russia and to the Syrian government. Finally, I end with this well-known prayer of Reinhold Niebuhr, which you may know, in which he refers to the virtues of serenity, wisdom, and courage. Because the previous recommendations concern only strategic policy, but staff of NGOs and politicians are dealing now with a world that's where a just order seems very far away. And the effects of our efforts often seem very small compared to the root causes of migration. So how do we hold out to continue to work for a better and a juster world, a more just world? I think we may benefit from the perspective of virtues. Virtues offer more than the universal standards of human rights and an individual moral perspective. Virtues can also be applied in situations where the standards of human rights are simply unattainable, and as one of the staff members I interviewed said, only a few people can save from that. And doing good in a broken world, I think needs, in addition to courage, justice, faith, hope and charity, also a lot of wisdom and humility. And I think we desperately need all these virtues to bring about a just order. And I will continue to introduce the next speaker, Arleen. Arleen, she's the founder and executive director of the Economic Summit. It's an organization that exists to promote awareness and implementation of new paradigms on finance and economy based on Christian tradition, faith and thought. Since its inception in 2014, the Summit has become a body that is starting to advise governments and industry in Europe, Africa and South America. She's also the director of the new Center for Economics and Mutuality, based at the Erasmus University in Rotterdam. Today, Arleen will speak about providing next generations Africans with hope in the future of their nations. Arleen.
Thank you very much, Lawrence. I'm just going to make sure that, one moment, just for the PowerPoint presentation. There we are. All right, thank you, Lawrence. The title of my presentation, indeed, is Providing Next Generation of Africans with Hope in the Future of Their Country. Now, as Lawrence mentioned, I am the director of an organization called the Economic Summit. And in that capacity, I do a lot of work in Africa. And as a result, we as Economic Summit, we have quite a large network of relationships and contacts across the continent in different regions. Now, as a start today, I want us to take a look for a moment at the definition of the word hope, because it is the hope for something better than what the people have right now that drives individuals and families to cross deserts and continents and then to get into rickety boats to try to come to Europe. And so what precisely is hope? Now, hope is a feeling, and it's an expectation or a desire for a particular thing to happen. A second definition is that hope is to want something to happen or for that to be the case. And so that is something that we're going to take with us as we move through this presentation today. And I am just going to continue, and there we are. Now, the research questions that I have posed in order to prepare for this presentation is Lawrence has already mentioned, among other things, that the situation of those who've been forced to flee from their homes in Syria and Yemen due to conflict. He's already talked about those things. And so I'm not going to address these things today in my presentation. Conflict-induced migration is different from other forms of migration. Instead, today I'm going to be focusing on what is happening in the continent of Africa itself and on the perspective of the next generation of Africans. I'll also be discussing which solutions the next generation have for national and pan-African reforms, and what are the implications of what we've learned from them for the EU's development policy. Why am I taking this frame of reference? It's because if we're really looking for long-term solutions, one of the things that we also have to consider is what are the push factors from the continent itself that fuel migration. Now, in order to do this research, I have conducted interviews, in this case with a number of Africans, and of whom the majority were next generation, between 20 and 30 years old. I've also interviewed one sitting Minister of Finance of an African nation who is a member of the African Union, and representatives from several NGOs, two of which provide emergency relief in Africa and in the Middle East. And now I've divided my presentation today into 3 sections. And the first one is the current situation on the continent. The second section is next generation perspectives, and the third section is recommendations for NGOs and for the EU's development policy. Now I'm going to start actually with the current situation, and I'm going to start with demographics. The PIN code of the world right now is 1114. I'll repeat that. The PIN code of the world right now is 1114. And by that I mean that there are 1 billion people in the Americas, North and South America combined, 1 billion people in Europe, 1 billion people in Africa, and about 4 billion people in Asia. And when I say Asia, that also includes China and Oceania. By 2050, however, the PIN code of the world will be 1135, and that's based on UN population growth estimates. And that means that there are going to be 1 billion people in the Americas. North America's population will shrink, but that will be compensated for by the growth in population in South America. Europe's population is going to shrink to slightly less than 1 billion. However, Africa's population between now and 2050 is going to triple to 3 billion people. No other continent on the world is going to experience that kind of population growth. The population of Asia is going to grow from 4 to 5 billion, so a 25% increase. And so this is important for our discussion today. Why? Because it means that Africa will continue to be a young continent with a median age being between 18 and 19 years old. Now on this slide, I show the poverty headcount percentage ratio per continent. And this slide shows that the poverty actually, it's a poverty rate among nations is one of the other ways of saying that. And the estimates were based on household surveys. Now, in this diagram, the darker the color, the higher the rate of poverty in a nation or in a region. And you can see from this slide that the Middle East, that has a slightly darker orange color. And North Africa also too. And that is due to the conflicts in Syria and in Yemen. That has increased poverty in the Middle East and in Northern Africa. But what I find particularly shocking is that sub-Saharan Africa is dark purple. And that means that the majority of those who are living in poverty or abject poverty are found in this region. And as we look at this graph, the next slide, the reality is really shocking. Why? Because you can see that 56.2% of all of the world's poor live in sub-Saharan Africa. Why is that significant for our discussion today? It's because poverty is one of the main drivers of migration, not only in Africa, but across the world. These particular graphs on the next slide show the trend in the working age population, that is people between 15 and 64 years of age in Africa, compared with Southeast Asia and with Latin America, and it goes up to the year 2055. And what you can see there with the orange line is that that working age population in Africa is going to skyrocket. Now, if we add this to the fact that by 2035, 450 million new jobs are going to be required on the continent to accommodate this region's working age population, and that the continent only has the capacity right now to create 100 million of these jobs that are going to be required, it's saying to us that if we do not address this issue as Europeans, we're going to be looking at an even greater possibility of a humanitarian disaster than we have had up until now. Why? Because currently 80% of African migration occurs within Africa itself. Only about 20% actually leaves the continent. However, the strong population growth expected by 2035 and the marked increase in unemployment will be a significant push factor for migration to destinations outside of Africa. And if we also add to all of these things the fact that those who succumb to radicalization are usually the young, the poor, and the disenfranchised, then we can conclude that we have to act, because sectarian violence also has a large chance of becoming a major push factor in this continent. And therefore, this is a very European problem. Now, this slide contains a quote from the World Bank Competitiveness Report from 2018. And essentially it says that the overall aim is job creation. And the concrete possibility of reaping the demographic dividend, the report states, depends actually critically on how many people are able to be employed, what percentage of the population is actually working. And here, when we talk about demographic dividend, we mean that the area has more people working than those who are collecting a pension. Now, the second part of my talk is aimed at the next generation perspectives. And in order to get this, I conducted interviews with next generation Africans, as I mentioned earlier, between 20 and 30 years old, some of who were planning to leave the continent and others who had already left. Now, it is extremely difficult to get accurate information from boat refugees in Europe because they're afraid. They're afraid of being deported. And therefore, I have to say at the beginning of this section that none of the interviews that I conducted were with boat refugees, but these people were familiar and they knew of those who fall into this category. Now, I'll start with a quote as we look at this slide from a young man who grew up in rural South Africa about children in schools in rural Africa. Essentially, he said, I was giving a talk to final year students at a rural high school in the Northern Cape province, and my heart broke when I listened to their answers to my question about what they were going to do next year when they finished school. There was such a sense of hopelessness, he said. They didn't know what they wanted to do. There were no resources for them, and they didn't really have access to further opportunities or even know about what was available to them. And that actually broke my heart when I was conducting my interview with this gentleman. But a number of the things that the next generation brought up that they see as being critical problems was, number one, people don't appreciate their heritage. Why? Because what they learn in school has been westernized. Culturally, they said we are more Western than African, and that's why we grow up longing to immigrate to either Europe or the United States. And so, therefore, their proposal was to Africanize the system. And one young lady, an architecture student in Ghana, said, to give African young people hope in a future, young people need to read books about people just like themselves. She said, I grew up reading books about Cinderella with long flowing blonde hair. She said, Africans don't look like that. We need more African stories that African young people can relate to. It also said Africans have lost hope, especially the young, in that their countries are in their countries and they don't believe that their countries and their governments are there for them. And so they proposed it's a serious need to encourage and mentor more young people to become politically active. Many sub-Saharan African nations actually have an age limit at which people can enter politics, and that age is quite high. So most young Africans don't feel that they have a say or that they're even going to be heard. Another thing that they mentioned was a lack of healthy infrastructure in healthcare, education, etc., plus concerns about safety. Institutional and governmental changes are critically needed, but we're not going to get this from the old guard, they find. I was speaking in an interview to a young man from an African nation, and he essentially said, I am building my telecom company here in the United Kingdom. And he said, the things that prevent me from returning to my home nation to try and build that up is, he said, I have concerns about the safety of my family, and the infrastructure just does not exist for my industry in my nation. And lastly on this slide, there are dilemmas surrounding rural young people. I started this section with a quote from that young man who grew up in rural South Africa. Often the young feel forgotten and left behind, but most of Africans who live in sub-Saharan Africa live in rural areas. And so there's a big role for diaspora Africans that they can play here, as well as Africans who succeeded and who still are in Africa. And that is that they go back to their schools, in their villages and in their towns, and that they tell their stories. Why? Because when African young people living rurally see them who have risen above their situations and made something of their lives, they start to believe that they can do it too. And so that is one of the things there. The next thing is that the church is not considered to be relevant in sub-Saharan Africa. Many young people have said it's not being the salt and light that it's supposed to be, and the church is highly resistant to change. A quote from a young Nigerian lady who is an entrepreneur who lives in London. She said, the church in Africa gives you the idea that you cannot be successful and be a Christian. Therefore, if you're successful in business, you feel like you either have to give up your business or leave the church. And so that is one of the things that they said. And the last thing that I'm going to mention in this topic is just that there's a dire need to encourage Christian influencers with resources to come together to develop a long-term vision for their nation. And if this doesn't happen, I was told, by the young, children will continue to be sent overseas to study, and they'll stay there. Ifosa Ojomo, he's a gentleman who wrote a book. He's a co-author of one called The Prosperity Paradox. He said, when I was 17, I got a scholarship to study in the United States. I flew to America from my home nation on a one-way ticket, and I vowed never to return. So there's a brain drain. There's a wealth drain, and also there is a brave drain. And why do I say that? It's because those who get in the boats, who actually cross continents to get in a boat, they have to have a lot of courage in order to do that. And this is the kind of courage that is needed to rebuild and to build up sub-Saharan African nations. Now, I show this slide just very shortly to show you the Christian population in African countries. You'll notice that that is the highest in sub-Saharan Africa. And so I show this slide just simply to say that the church has to play a role in what is going to happen after this. Now, the third part of my presentation has to do with recommendations. And the first recommendation is to stimulate entrepreneurship. Looking at the demographics that I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, it is a non-negotiable necessity to invest in the new economy. And when I say in the new economy in Africa, I mean in the digital economy. And so we're talking now not just about social businesses as we stimulate entrepreneurship, but there is a dire need to redefine the purpose of business completely. And the economics of mutuality, which is what we deal with in the Economic Summit, I'm hearing from actually NGO workers that is perfect for developing nations. Why? Because it redefines the purpose of business from just being to maximize profit for the shareholders to the purpose of business is to solve the problems of people and planet profitably without that profit creating problems for people and planet. And next thing that they emphasized, the next generation, was to focus on skills development, but this time not just on basket weaving or sewing, but on digital skills for boys and girls. For example, coding boot camps. They've been shown to work. And a concrete example of that is the company Cloud Factory in the United States. Google outsources their data analysis to Cloud Factory, and Cloud Factory employs 7,000 to 8,000 people on the African continent to analyze their data, and they earn a good wage. Many also look at Ibrahim. He is the founder of a telecom company called Celtel, as an example for showing that you can be successful in business in Africa in a high corruption environment without participating in the corruption of the system. Mo started Celtel in 1998 with the vision of providing affordable mobile phones to the average African. But before he could sell the phones, he had to literally build the infrastructure that was needed with all of the towers, etc., because it didn't exist. And one of the key lessons that he taught is that in Africa, you need to be willing to go the extra mile. However, today there are over 1 billion mobile phone subscriptions on the continent, and in 2005, he sold Celtel for $3.4 billion US, and now helps with entrepreneurship on the continent. Finally, the last slide I want to show is recommendations for NGOs and EU development policy. Number one, coming from the next generation, is develop local leadership capacity to serve change. They said we need to have faith in ourselves that we can solve our own problems, and so indigenous and not imported. Second thing they said is, look what works in our communities because we know the cultural context and come alongside of that instead of starting something new. A third thing that they recommended was that NGOs should use their philanthropic capital to help to start businesses. And in turn, the NGOs can say to their partners and their business sponsors, we don't just want access to your capital, we want access to your supply chain. A fourth recommendation, and that has to do with EU development policy, is focus on facilitating the creation of stable institutions and healthy national infrastructures in healthcare, in education, in food, and media and entertainment, etc. And finally, the key areas that they identify for African investment are agribusiness, digital innovation, and manufacturing on the African subcontinent. If I just take agribusiness really quickly, in 2017, when we held our Economic Summit Africa meeting in Cape Town, one of my personal aims was to discover which challenge, if addressed, could have the biggest influence across several sectors. And the answer was agriculture. Why? Because 30 to 40% of the GDP of every single sub-Saharan African nation comes from agriculture. 65 to 70% of the people employed work in this industry, and 80% of the abject poor, those are the people who run the risk of dying of starvation, are women and small stakeholder farmers who are trying to eke out a living on 2 hectares of land or less. So agriculture addresses economic growth, it addresses employment, and it addresses food security in one fell swoop. And so, just in order to conclude this presentation, as I said at the beginning, this presentation doesn't deal with the boat migrants directly. Our research that we're doing is not finished yet. It still continues. However, the main point that I've tried to make is that if we're going to come up with effective long-term solutions for migration, we have to help people to find hope in the future of their countries. And it is my pleasure and honor to introduce Dr. Luc Gnacadja, who is our keynote speaker. Luc is the founder and the president of an organization called Governance and Policies for Sustainable Development, or GPS-Dev. Luc is a Benin national and a tri-sector leader in management. And the sectors that Luc is involved in are government, business, and nonprofit. He has held many high-profile positions, both at national and international levels. Luc has, for instance, received acknowledgements and recognition for his services as Minister of the Environment in Benin, Minister of Housing and Urban Development, and as the Executive Secretary of the United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification. In this latter capacity, Luc has been an architect of the concept of land degradation neutrality, and that is now embedded in the 2030 United Nations Sustainable Development Goals as target 15.03. Luc is, as I said, the founder and president of GPS-Dev, and GPS-Dev is a Benin-based think and do think. Luc, thank you for joining us. It's a pleasure to have you, and the floor is now yours.
This story tells the story of all the migrants who dream of El Dorado. And he endeavored to have a mural fresco in Paris in remembrance of this tragedy. The second tale is a tale of Fatim Jawara, 19. She's a Gambian goalkeeper. She was actually the goalkeeper of the national football team of women's national football team of the Gambia. And in February 2016, she left her home and traveled across the Sahara Desert to Libya. And once in Libya, she contacted her family and informed that she was traveling to Europe to seek a position playing for a major European club. And at the end of October 2016, she attempted to cross the Mediterranean Sea, and unfortunately, due to a severe storm, the boat sank and she died, 19 years old. And you see her brother holding a picture of Fatim Jawara. And the third tale is the one that we would all like to hear about, is the tale of Mamadou Gassama, 25 nowadays. Mamadou Gassama is a Malian migrant in Paris, hailed as a hero after mounting a daring rescue to save a 4-year-old boy dangling from a balcony in Paris at the 14th floor. He has been invited to Élysée Palace by President Macron, who gave him a medal for courage and granted him French citizenship. At the time when he has gained that national fame, it was in May 2018, he was still an illegal alien in France. And the whole story has actually fueled the French public debate on migration. So you can see from this point that it really takes confidence on oneself, on the gift that you have, on the talent maybe, but at least on the skills to venture in the risky and unknown trip like the tragic odyssey we have seen for the two teenagers, and also that may end like the one of Mamadou. So I would like to suggest the following definition of migration. There are many, but I like these ones. Migration is a response to development context and prospect in any society. It is a natural way of responding to economic and development dynamics in societies. Migration is therefore a double-edged sword that requires thoughtful and collaborative effort for it to lead to win-win development outcome for both host and originating countries. That's why in the African Migration Report that has been titled Challenging the Narrative, they concluded by saying that migration is a strong barometer of development progress dynamics. So we can here take this as a takeaway. Hope, sometimes unrealistic or poorly invested for a better future, is the main driver of migration. But here are few data about who migrates. You have those data from the UN data about the global population. And in 2017, the global, may I say, stock of migrants was some 257 million plus people globally. And if you take it from there, you want to see who migrates, you will see that compared to the ratio of global population versus the ratio in international migrants or immigrants, if you like, Europeans are the largest emitter of international immigrants when compared to its share of the world population. Europe is. And this is something that is important to bear in mind, that we are all, one way or the other, homo migrants, one way or the other. The other point I would like to highlight here is also about who migrate. You can see that the population of migrants globally has been somehow been the same, around 3% since 1995 till 2019. It has evolved from 2.8 to 3.5%. And you will also see that female are 48% of the population of migrants. It is quite high. And if you want to also recall, and I would like to recall that among the migrants, we have not only refugees, but the so-called internally displaced person. And in 2018, the global population of refugees was 25.9 million, and 52% of them were under 18 age. And if you think of the so-called internally displaced people that end up also crossing the borders, there were 41.3 million people in 2018. So I would like to share with you the following messages, the key messages from the 2020 migration report. It is quite interesting, and you may peruse it if you are interested. One of the things you can see is that COVID-19 has heavily impacted migration trends, flows, and also impacted, including the remittances that the migrants do send back home. And you can also see that, especially in 2020, the flow of migrants has been reduced by 2 million, and the remittances has fallen by 7% and will further fall this year according to the forecast. And you will also see that the three key or main of worrying observation as far as I'm concerned, which I would like you to also take into consideration, is that over time, migration, which is something that has been here and is here to stay, has become, particularly immigration, has become a prominent international and national policy issues, which in national discourse has become very much polarized, with the space for balanced, rigorous, and evidence-based analysis having diminished over time. And that's why in my contribution, we would really much like to provide data that will help us from here rather promote, impulse evidence-based narratives and evidence-based policy making, and reduce the toxicity of the migration debate that has further intensified over the last few years with the politics of fear and division and xenophobia. Now, what are the push and pull factors of migration? The predominant narrative that migration arises from failed development and hampers development for both the sending and the recipient or the host country. But evidence shows that migration is both the result of development and a means to achieve it. And if you look at those who migrate, you will see that somehow they are not the poorest of the poor in a given country, but they are somehow like the middle class per se, who have some skill, have some hope, have some connection abroad, or could, with the saving of their family, gather some resources to finance the trip. And migrants' characteristics also show that there's a need for a minimum of education and a kind of stamina to decide to migrate. So, and you will also notice that the push factor is quite synonymous to the pull factors. Push factors are armed conflicts, natural disasters, lack of job opportunities, possession of economic and cultural capital that one might like to, provide abroad as skills, dissatisfaction with one's own life or surrounding, and also persecution or lack of religious freedom. And if you put that in the context of the pull factors, it reads greater security, better job opportunities, or the prospect of a more exciting life, presence of relatives or communities members in the destination country, and freedom of religion or opinion, among others. But in the few last 2 decades or per se, there are 2 emerging push-pull factors. One is a strong one, that is climate and environment change. The environmental mobility that sometimes we call transhumance, or sometimes we call forced migration due to natural disaster, is really a strong push factor that is allowing those who can afford to migrate to cross their border from the neighboring country, first from the neighboring city, from the neighboring country, and sometimes cross the ocean. And another pull factor now is the aging of rich countries' population due to low fertilities. But few elements that will help, hopefully, dig into the migrants' contribution to their countries, both destination and countries of origin. I would like to suggest the following. For the host country, and according to numerous studies that are now available, immigration is a catalyst for economic growth and change. Migrants provide a source of dynamism globally, and also in their communities, they are really source of innovation are much more even overrepresented in any countries regarding innovation, patent, and science awards, startup, and successful companies. For instance, if you consider the case of the US, though the US is somehow a kind of migrant nation, though some tend not to remember that, migrants represent only 13% of the population in the US, but they are 40% of all entrepreneurs, and they have the triple of the number of natives if you consider who are Nobel laureates or who are a member of the National Academy of Science. This is to say that because a migrant is someone who has stamina, who has hope, who is really committed for change and for well-being, they really invest themselves to make a difference. And another point is that migrants being comparatively younger than local population, they also have a significant positive impact on GDP. And you can see the numbers regarding if only the UK or Germany have seized from 1990, they have closed their borders and stopped receiving any migrant. You see the numbers regarding how much they will have lost for their GDP. But as for the country of origin, it is about international remittances. And you see that the remittances globally, they have overtaken the foreign direct investment in 2019, according to the World Bank. And they have also overtaken the ODA a few years before, overtaking the FDI, including in Africa. And in 2018, the global remittances amounted 689 billion. And you can see among the other contribution to their country of origin, you have that migrants, they do invest in businesses at home. They also influence human capital stocks. They also work in reducing information asymmetries with regard to how their country of origin interact with their country of destination. So those things are very much important. That's why I would like to bring this question before all of us. What will it be? What will be a balanced strategy to make the contribution optimally, if not maximally, but visible, acknowledged, and accepted on the global and national policies agenda? This will be key for having a not perception laden debate, but rather fact-based debate. So let me provide you with a perspective that is somehow mine, but also that of a report that is called the African Migration Report, and that has provided what could be migration for co-development between Africa and Europe, for instance, and other neighboring regions. There are four things that I would like to cover. First, Africa is globally a repellent continent for migrants, although, and you see why I put although, and why is the narrative about African migration so distorted? We need to address it if we really want to have a kind of win-win strategy to make migration an asset for co-development. And what are the key trends of African migration and migration for Africa transformation? What might be the paradigm shift? So the perception biases I was relating to is that, yes, Africa received less migrants than Africa emits migrants. But because there are many aspects that are not accounted for instance, a European immigrant in Africa is everything but a migrant. is called, perceived, and even perceived himself as an entrepreneur, an investor, an expert, a prospector, a manager, or sometimes a tourist, but not really an immigrant. Now, if you consider the 2017, 47% of international migrants were women in Africa. When I say international migrant, I mean those who leave their country, being to go to another country in Africa or abroad. And the average age of the so-called international migrant is 31 years. The top destination of migration in Africa are South Africa and Cote d'Ivoire, and the hubs are Abidjan, Joburg, and Nairobi. Now, why is the narrative about Africa's migration so distorted? Like, African migration is a south to north movement and fear of a groundswell of Africans coming to Europe. While, according to the data available and that has been well documented since a while, the share of African living abroad is not increasing. African accounts for 14% of global migrant population, and 18% of Africans thinking about migration have no interest in leaving the continent, according to a report of the International Organization of Migration. Across ocean takes on a regular form. 94% takes on a regular form. Yes, but in recent years, the migration crisis in the Mediterranean Sea has sadly become the poster child for African migration. But we must not only address that, but go beyond it if you really want to have a fact-based policies. More than 1 in 2 African migrants move to another African country, and we will see why. And the number of African immigrants settling legally in EU member states has dropped significantly in the past decade, and that is in a GRC, the Joint Research, the Joint Research Institution of the European Commission that has been released in 2018. So those elements are to be taken into consideration for, again, fact-based policies. Now, I suggest those 3 main reasons that you can also see in the Africa Migration Report. I have added one. What are the 3 main reasons why the distortion exists and persists? First is that most people who write about African migration are from the West due to the paucity of African scholarship related to migration. That is a point that we need to address if we really want to have to build a kind of co-designed and co-implemented policy to address and make migration an asset for EU and Africa. The second one is that within Africa, where there is an AU, African Union migration policy framework that exists, but it is not really coordinated in its implementation. And the third one is that despite the existence of myriad of migration dialogues between interstate and regions, there are at least 8 of them, not much active cooperation and information sharing is available. And for all those reasons, migration initiatives are mostly oriented towards the concern of donor countries instead of being homegrown and being driven by African aspiration. Now, if you consider who migrate in Africa, you will see that 41 million of international migrants within and from or to Africa in 2017, 19 million were residing within the continent, 17 million residing outside, and 5 million are from the rest of the world who migrated to Africa. That is the movement. And if you look at the map, you will see that within region, people do migrate and stay within the region. And the international migration from the rest of the world to Africa, they really mainly go to the natural resource-rich countries such as South Africa, DRC, Libya, as you can see in the map. In the pie, you will see that the colors represent the origin of the migrant. And here is who migrate in Africa. And you see, regarding migrant to Africa, it's almost flat. That is the first column. And the second one, migrant within Africa, you see how it has taken a sharp rise recently. And of course, migrants from Africa is on the sharp rise as well. But migrant within Africa is still higher than the one from Africa to go abroad. And destination of the 40.2 million migrants from Africa at mid-year of 2019, you can see that 53% of them, they stay in Africa. 26% they migrated to Europe, followed by 11% to Asia, 18% to North America. And those numbers also will help to focus on. And now, what are the contributions of the African diaspora to the continent's development? You see, from investment to heritage trade, to tourism, to knowledge transfer, to technology transfer, and community projects, and even philanthropy. All this is done not only by personal involvement in knowledge transfer, for instance, but also through remittances. And the remittances in Africa in 2019 was up to $48 billion. But it has dropped. The forecasts are that it has dropped in 2020 from 48 to 38 in 2020, and further to 37, in 2020, and to 38 billion in this year, as according to the forecast. So, of course, the combination of population dynamics and development, and as Arleen have said, the way the success or even the failure to capitalize on the potential for demographic dividend is the point. Now, look at the sharp rise of population in Africa. It is indeed rising, and the way to address it is, again, by investing in education and investing in health and investing in the environment. Those are the priority areas if you want to address the issue. And look at the pyramids. And you know that in the pyramids that are according to the different region, being North Africa, Eastern, Western, and Central Africa, and Southern Africa, you see that the shape of the pyramid are quite different. But it shows that in Eastern, Western, and Central Africa, the base of the pyramid is quite large, which shows that the population is very young, and this may lead to, unless the issue is addressed likely, that socioeconomic development takes place, that climate change is kept under control. If not, then political instability, violence, and other will certainly become even much more strong push factors. And here is an example of how desertification threatens human security in Africa. You see that when drought, or because of drought is often followed by rain, that causes flash flood, and this will, of course, reduce the number of the share available, the pie of natural resources being land and water, and then that's how desertification and land degradation or environmental degradation will cause loss of available natural resources for livelihood. That will cause vulnerability, poverty, food insecurity, and then conflict over scarcer resources, and then people will fight to have access to the resources and fight or flee. And that is why the environmental risks are becoming and likely to be a stronger push factor in Africa. And of course, then climate change, biodiversity loss, desertification are really to be considered. For instance, in 2019, 2.6 million people have been displaced in Sub-Saharan Africa due to drought, cyclone, and flood. And you can see those three maps that are showing. On the left side, you have the dry land of Africa. In the middle, you have, it has been marked, for instance, where they have conflict and food drought has taken place in 27, 28. And you can see 4 years following where have been the terrorist attacks. So where the vulnerability takes place, where people have lost hope, they become an easy prey for those who are promoting integrism. And here is a security flashpoint, of Africa and the migration impact it's having. You can see where, for instance, Niger, there have been 174,000 people displaced. And in Mali, in Nigeria, for instance, of course, we have Boko Haram, but there's a story that is not well told, is that the conflict between herders and farmers is causing more death than the issue of or the casualty or the killing of the terrorists. And you see from different countries, Ethiopia, Sudan, and some, for instance, Ethiopia is a country that is hosting more than 2 million of internally displaced people. And this is, of course, a risk for further migration beyond national borders. Now let's see what the migration for Africa transformation, what it may look like. There are 5 broad categories of mega trends driving African migration future. And if we work on them appropriately for cooperation, we are likely to make migration an asset for partnership between Africa and Europe. Knowledge growth, economic growth, empowerment of youth, empowerment of women, how to connect with globalization and build comparative advantage, and of course, how to respect all this with the anthropogenic change. And this is, the anthropogenic change is the one that helps to not just look at what is abroad as what is good for us, but being homegrown, oriented in whatever is to be done. So here is a conceptual framework of migration and structural transformation in Africa. You can see from on the first layer, you have the factors influencing migration. You have the micro level and individual factors, and you have the meso level and macro level factors. From the micro level, of course, is gender, culture, income, and education and skills. But on the macroeconomic level, you have, of course, conflicts, international institutions that may be playing or not playing their role, but also you have climate change-related events and shocks. And all this will have a play in individual making decisions to migrate. And it is at that juncture that you must make sure that impact for structural transformation will have a feedback loop into decision-making. And you have all those elements starting at the internal migration. What are the skill acquisition that could help internal migration within Africa to become an asset, both for host country and for a country of origin. And this is important given the high percentage of migrants stay in the continent. That is a very important point of action and partnership for that between, for instance, EU and Africa may consider this as a key point and to act on intra-African migration. And then certainly this will lower the pressure, the push factor on external migration. But I will avail myself for Q&A on this if needed be. And here are three scenarios of future socioeconomic, demographic, and migratory development in Africa. I will put two scenarios or two options before you. The one developed by the GRC in a report in which I have accepted those three scenarios, and the second one is developed by the African Union. And you will see some differences, but it helps to understand the dynamics in policy making. The first scenario built by the GRC, the Joint Research Center of the EU, is a scenario that is about the continuation of current socioeconomic development trends. And in that regard, current being 2015, immigration rate will remain constant. But higher population growth in line with current trends is also in that scenario. And the result of it will be that the number of Africans leaving their country of origin will increase by 1.4 million in 2015 to reach 2.8 million in 2050. Now, if you take the second scenario, where there's more rapid socioeconomic development and immigration rate will rise, because immigration, as I said, is a kind of development is correlated by immigration and vice versa. So if for the first decade of rapid socioeconomic development, we must expect that people, those who will move into the low, into the middle class, will likely to look for option to migrate if they have the means to do it. In one way or the other, that's what data have shown globally, from Asia to Africa to Europe as well. So lower population growth as a result of economic growth of education, and then the number, because of development, the number of Africans leaving their country of origin will increase from 1.4 million in 2015 to 3.5 million in 2050 in this scenario. And the third one is the scenario that is the worst of the three. It's the one where the play of climate change will be the hardest, where socioeconomic development is disrupted by several issues like conflict, like climate change, like environmental degradation, displacement, and immigration will rise sharply due to desertification and scarcity in livelihood-based resources, and a higher population growth, because we must bear in mind that population growth is reduced where there is development, especially through education. This is the worst scenario, and it has not been possible, as the authors of that report said, that for them to quantify how much it will be, but it will be much, much more than the three precedent scenarios, because there will be displacement, and there will be, therefore, a much more forced migration due to and displacement due to this scenario. There's a second one that I want to share with you before concluding about concluding with what Europe might do. It is the one that is in the Africa Migration Report. They came up with three scenarios. The first scenario is the scenario that is called Empowered Africa. Africa has embraced, in that scenario, Africa has embraced the tradition of leapfrogging, meaning to create or to build a comparative advantage by creating sustainable jobs, by embracing what technology offers, and also ensuring that farming has become high-tech and low impact. And in that regard, migration within that scenario is that Africa will be able to manage its migration. And the migration will be much more driven by regional integration. And the conclusion here in the report is that a leapfrogging approach to migration may look apparently good, but its destabilizing impact on Africa makes it a suboptimal, though it is somehow desirable, but it's not optimal. The second one, that is the scenario of slowdown in the West, is the scenario whereby developed countries, especially Europe and America, will close themselves and then severely limiting prospects for migration from Africa to Europe, and then also closing and limiting prospects for Africa building its own comparative advantage. In this scenario, the slowdown in the West is projected to cause a return of the African diaspora to some extent back to Africa. And there is some migration out of Africa, but mainly of highly educated people who will then maybe prefer to go much more to Asia than elsewhere. And the slowdown of the West will lead to a large scale of return from the previous African diaspora. And the third scenario, that is the one the authors has preferred, is the one that is called the African way. In this one, most of the experience and capacity and potential for development is homegrown, is led by African people's aspiration, and is not and is also built on the comparative advantage of the continent. And in that scenario, family planning and improved education of women has reduced population growth to less than the UN's median forecast. And the population will not go beyond 2.3 billion by 2050. The African way offers opportunities for Africa to become migration and investment destination to the rest of the world, while at the same time becoming the feeder of overdeveloped and underutilized infrastructure facilities in regions that have experienced or are experiencing aging population. So those are the three. Now, how could we advance the African migration agenda? 4 points are put here, but the first one is that the African Union should really be able and be successful in advancing the African migration agenda. That is underpinned by the strategic and pivotal role of migration can play in the broader development and transformation of the continent. And if this is done, then there may be a need to move past a kind of Western-driven approach and initiative to migration, whereby Africa will be able to master the challenge of migration, including study it, including having capacity to forecast and design it, and that will help to make migration an asset for not only the continent transformation, but co-partnership with EU, for instance. And then there are a question to answer. What will an African approach to mobility look like? With what presumptions will it begin? How will it be built on histories for Pan-Africanism and African hospitality? Those are assets. How will it build on it? And most importantly, what kind of policies will it bring forth? Those questions are still to be worked on, and that's why it is important to study this and make sure that it comes from home. Then, what might be the role of Europe? I think perception and narrative change for effective and fact-based policy making is key. That is why I really commend the organizer of this symposium, and do hope that we will all, through our exchanges here, be agent of that narrative and perception change. A migration for development agenda with Africa could be advanced further, and we will see to what extent it fits into the so-called Marshall Plan for Africa, and contribute through development and cooperation and partnership to mitigating the push factor and forced environmental force or induced migration. When we look at migrants, that they have hope, and hope is the key element of an entrepreneur. So helping them to better invest that hope in the opportunity that are at their doorstep is certainly something that will be beneficial for both parties, being Europe and Africa, in that co-design and co-development of partnership regarding migration. And climate change and forced migration are a nexus here, where there's a need to invest in the adaptation mechanism and capacity building and infrastructure to help local communities to develop resilience and help youth, I have said, invest their hope in the opportunity lying at their doorstep. And in the context of what Europe could do, we have the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan, as it is designed, is certainly a context, because it is not a Marshall Plan for Africa. It is a Marshall Plan with Africa. And this is a key point to underscore, because it means that it is something to sit, design together, and implement together. And that will make sure that the Marshall Plan with Africa is built around the potential, the aspiration, and the projection of African as well. And when you looked at the 10 starting point of the Marshall Plan, as it is available in the German Ministry of Cooperation website, you will see that it is first, we need a new pact on the future between Europe and Africa, a new pact. And that it is based on African solution. It prioritizes job and opportunities for young people. It is about investment in entrepreneurship, and it's about creation of value and not of exploitation. And on, you have them all there. And it is also by learning the lesson that ODA cannot provide all the answers, and that it's about equitable global structure and institutions and reform partnership to ensure that, of course, accountability prevails and beyond. And it is, the potential of it is here. Now, it's all about the size of the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan, of course, what history taught us is that the Marshall Plan was about 4.7% of the U.S. economy, the size of the U.S. economy in 1948, because it was about 13 billion in terms of 1948. That was equivalent to 47% of the U.S. economy. So in today's term, if you want to translate that into today's term in building the parallel, it will be equivalent to $1 trillion of US dollars. The amount may sound enormous, but as it is a win-win deal, we must make sure that first, the Marshall Plan gains traction, and then if it gains traction and those 7 at least starting points of its design are really well managed, then indeed the Marshall Plan is likely to lead to making migration an asset for EU-Africa partnership. So to conclude, And I would like to suggest 2 quotes. And the second one is the one I wish that you will keep in among your takeaways. Migration is a strong barometer of development progress dynamics. And the second one is migration is as natural as breathing, as eating, as sleeping. It is part of life, part of nature. So we have to find a way of establishing a proper kind of scenario for modern migration to exist. And when I say we, I mean the world. We need to find ways of making that migration not forced. And the one who wrote that quote is Joël Garcia Bernal. He is a Mexican filmmaker. Thank you very much for your time and for the opportunity to contribute and also to listen to learn.
Thank you for presenting an alternative view on migration from an African perspective. Thank you very much. Here with us are Joël Voordewind and Minella van Bergeijk. Thank you for joining us here. Minella van Bergeijk, she's the director of Teervent Netherlands. Teervent is an emergency relief and development and advocacy organization. And before working for Teervent, she worked at the Evangelical Broadcasting, a Christian Broadcasting Association. And as a panelist, she will respond to the various contributions. The other panelist here on my left side is Joël Voordewind. He was a member of the Dutch House of Representatives for the Christian Union from 2006 until very recently, March 2021. He was, among other things, responsible for the portfolios of asylum and migration, development aid and defense. And he's known for his commitment to human rights, refugees and persecuted Christians. And before 2006, he worked for the NGOs Teervent and Dorcas. Thank you for joining us. Joël and Minella, I look forward to your contributions as panelists. We are a little bit short of time because of the technical difficulties, so we have to keep it a little shorter than we planned. But let me start with you, Minella. In an early conversation, you said that migration policy is not your core business, but you do see a lot happening with regard to global migration. You also mentioned the global consequences of migration, economic differences and the economics of exclusion, and the public opinion becoming increasingly negative about migration. And you indicated you wanted to say some things about that. But first, can you respond to the speakers? And the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you. I will keep it short for you. Good day. This morning I was sitting in my car and I was driving home from the office to my home, and I was listening to a radio station, and I heard a story about people in Amsterdam who were protesting and asking for some rights because they want to choose for themselves when they wanted to die. And they didn't want to die because other people or other decision makers would be part of their death. They wanted to choose by themselves when they want to die, how they want to die, and not being intervened by somebody else. I think when we think about being in the Netherlands, being part of the European story, we have to think about one thing, and that's who is man? Who are you listening to this moment? Maybe you're sitting at home having some wine with you because it's Friday afternoon, or maybe you are just picking up some children, but it's you in the first place by your own will who can choose to be part of this moment. And I think that's a different story when we think of people always on the other side of the south or on the world, when you don't have all the efforts or the moments or the things you want to have by yourself, although you always have a choice. Who is man? Abraham Joshua Hessel, is the person I'm always listening to when he says something about major problems. He's doing a step behind and says, who is man? And that's my question I want to address to you. Because when we are talking and what we hear this afternoon from Arleen, what we hear from Benin, from all the people all around the world, then I want to place one question behind it, and that's the question, who's man? Because when you don't know what the perspective is of one man, or the dreams, or the values, or even the struggles or the fairness, you don't know where you have to put the button on. Who's man? Who's man is a question for me as a CEO of an NGO organization. Who's man is the same question which I can ask to the political statements. Who's man is the same question for some who is fleeing from through Africa. Community is one of the main focuses we try to intervene and to make people responsible for their own future, trying to create some ownership, trying to create more stability, trying to create something for livelihood. But that's not the only thing we see and we recognize. We see a lot of major conflicts, and we know that there has to be some purpose in the future. And when we don't have the ability to create more purpose as an NGO world, then we always keep the focus on the social climate and on the social environment. And not because we want it, but we also have to have some abilities to create more for economic, environmental sustainability. And I think when we talk and see for the future, we can combine some social activities in a way that we can also find economic sustainability. There's something else. We always say that we don't have the opportunity to do something. But I think there are a lot of things we can do in the West where we are right now. Because when we see to the borders of the European country and all the kind of places like Lampedusa or Lesbos, we don't see them anymore. I don't hear them. I'm going home and I'm thinking of my surrounding. I look at the paper when I do want to choose. But we do have a choice. There's always a choice. We can create a better environment in the places where they are. We can see for things that are laws that are neglected, like genocides and all the things of violence, rape, which is on a large scale used, and we never use them for better laws or something like that. We vote for parties in election times which aren't looking to human rights at all or leave human rights behind. We have a choice, a far major choice than we usually think. It's our story in the Netherlands which can change the story for the global world. And it's the story of the people in the global south, wherever that may be, which also are able to change their world. But we have to see each other and we have to find each other's voices for a much better impact. So I hope that's what we're gonna do.
Thank you, Minella, and thank you, former speakers, to address this very difficult issue. It's good that Dr. Luc is with us. I hope you're still hearing us from Amsterdam. It's good to not only talk about Africa, but talk with Africa at the same time. So although we have some problems with the connection, we still I'm very happy that you are on this webinar to give your insights from Africa. Always feel secure to talk with Africa. When I think about migration, and I've been a member of parliament for now close to 15 years, I think back of some of my experience going to Lesbos, going to Macedonia, going to Syria, and I had to think back on the moment. It was about, I think, 2 years ago that we traveled to Lesbos, and we were there with the Dutch military police going offshore with their boats, and it was only about 5 minutes, 6 minutes away from the shore that we met the first rubber boat with the refugees. And I imagine still their look in their faces and the fear in their faces of, okay, now the police is coming or the military is coming and they want to send us back. And here goes our dream of a better life with our children, because a lot of small children, even babies, were on board. And whenever we approached the boat, and they figured out that we were not a threat, but we were coming to their rescue, you saw their faces tense down, saw their faces relaxing. And whenever we got them on our boat, they were yelling and shouting and cheering because they sensed they were freed. Not so much freed from Africa, because Africa, I know, as a country with a lot of challenges, but also a lot of beautiful sights and possibilities. But they were really glad to be on the boat. To recall another moment when I went to Macedonia, this was in 2015, the beginning of the big influx to Europe. I remember standing there on the border and looking at the big influx coming from Greece to Macedonia. And it was about, I asked the UNHCR guy, the refugee organization from the UN, how many people come each day? And he said to me, well, 7,000 each day are entering. And I said, what are you doing at the border now? He said, well, I'm counting them, and I have to report back to my office how many people will come. And I am assigned to see who is coming in. And I said, so what are your conclusions until now? He said, well, if I ask them, who are you? They say, I'm Mohammed. And if I ask them, where are you coming from? They say, Syria. And I said, well, that's strange, because I can see there's a lot of Afghan people. I went to Afghan before. I can tell there are a lot of Afghan people or people from Iran or Pakistan. He said, well, I don't have the time to check them, so I'll let them in. So this is, I think, the two situations that came to my mind, a challenge and also possibilities for people to enter Europe. This is the big challenge that the European Union is facing at the moment, the EU migration. And I've heard very carefully the speech of Dr. Luc, and he says, if I may summarize it a little bit, that the migration to Europe is not a threat, but it's a challenge for people to come to Europe, and it's a win-win situation. And that it really is a blessing for people to be able to travel. Is it within Africa, or is it even outside of Africa? And of course, I've listened to Lawrence and his Moria dilemma and the just order, and Arleen's appeal for hope for Africa and to create jobs, especially in the ICT sector. So that is really encouraging to hear all these stories and the challenges that are facing us. So I see the challenge on two levels. The EU migration level and policy. I've been faced with these challenges as well as a politician the last 15 years. And of course, even the bigger and the broader picture of economic perspective for Africa, which was one of the focus, I think, of Dr. Luc. And just to start out with the EU migration, and to keep it short, of course, we had the Turkey deal so 5-6 years ago, and it depends on the perspective where you look at it. It is complying with the goals they set before whenever they put the deal on paper to reduce the influx of migration. But if you look at the other goal, to respect the humanitarian caretaking of the refugees, it has been a complete disaster. We've seen the pictures in Turkey, we've seen the pictures in Lebanon. I've visited all of the surrounding countries where in Turkey 4 million refugees were taken in, and in Lebanon, a country with only 4 million, they took in 1.5 million. So it were big challenges. And if you look at the provision of services, we see a big gap of what should be provided and what was provided by the different countries concerning education for children, concerning possibilities to get decent jobs and decent salaries, to take care of their families in safe houses. So from that side, it was a complete disaster. And still it is. If we look at the Moria situation at the moment, people are in terrible situations. When I spoke to them, they said, well, we were looking for Europe as our paradise, but apparently we are treated less than dogs are treated here, even in Lesbos. So it is a big disgrace what we apparently approve and let happen in these border areas of European Union, as we call it, as a civilized continent. In Lebanon, we see the same situations where people can only work in certain limited sectors where they need unskilled laborers. How do we deal now with the challenge of migration in Europe? I see that one part of Europe is embracing the migration pact at the moment. Finally, we have a new proposal to come together and see how we can take care of this challenge that is before us. But at the same time, we see that a lot of European countries even are hesitant to go forward with the migration pact. So that is still a big challenge for the European Union as a whole. My plea at the last couple of months when I was in Parliament was, let's not wait until we all have an anonymous deal how to cope with the migration, but let's go along and go ahead with the coalition of the willing, with the countries that are willing to cooperate and come to a collective asylum seekers system, from a collective system on returnees to a collective system of selection on the EU borders, as well of a fair share of replacement and division over Europe. It is not that far yet, but we should come to, there's only one solution, to come to a collective asylum seekers system in Europe. We'll see how it goes. If it is concerning, and then I close, Chair, if it's concerning the broader picture of the root causes of migration, we saw, of course, and Dr. Luc referred to it, the proposal of Angela Merkel in 2017 to come to this Marshall Plan for Africa, Dr. Luc said correctly, with Africa, to see if we together could have a collective effort to raise the level of education, to create perspective for youth, for jobs, to increase the productivity of agriculture. So these were challenges, and my party, the Christian Union, was very in favor of embracing the Marshall Pact and the Marshall Proposal. But apparently in Europe there was not a common agreement on this pact, so it did not fly until now. But if we look forward, and I agree with Dr. Luc, the only way forward is the challenge of co-development. Africa and Europe should work together. And it's not the way that China is doing it right now, with the kind of exploitation of the economies of Africa, not like the European Union did before with the colonization of African economy, but more like Dr. Luc again said, let's look at the win-win situations. And to close, Chair, I would suggest three elements of the win-win situation. One, we should talk again in Europe about getting lower or even rid of the import barriers to Europe of products from Africa, to open our borders for the market of Africa. This is starting, but it's still not as far as we should like it to be at the moment. Secondly, let's look at cooperation and trade on a sustainable and a fair way. That's why we've proposed in my last week as a member of parliament to come with this new initiative law that if the Dutch multinational companies work in Africa or in Asia, they should do this as a sustainable and responsible way to prevent child labor, to prevent forced labor, to look for fair wages, living wages. And only on that way we should cooperate with Africa as a sustainable way. Thirdly, let's look at migrants not as a threat, but as a chance to help each other. At this moment, we are looking at a demographic rate in Europe of 1.8 children. So we cannot afford to keep hostile, to keep the migrants out. We should be, of course, selective of who we bring in as it concerns of threats, as we should prevent importing radical Islamic dangerous forces. Of course we should do that. If there are people that were involved with terrorist organizations, we should screen those persons. But there are a lot of migrants that are willing to help, and they have the capacity. Dr. Luc said, there are a lot of youngsters that are willing to be an entrepreneur in Europe to help us to develop Europe in the future. So let's see migration as a challenge, not be naive, but we need the migrants. And to close, to really close, because that's what we do in parliaments, always trying to extend our speaking time. But let's really close by saying that I think that God doesn't know legal persons, illegal persons. God only knows men who were created in the image of God. So let's be open to men worldwide and see how we can come to a win-win situation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Joel, and also to Minella for their very, very perceptive and moving presentations as a response to all of the presentations done today. Now, I'm going to set an ambitious goal that we're going to try and do the Q&A in 10 minutes. All right? And so that means I'm just looking through the chat right here. I'm going to assign different questions to different speakers. And I'm going to ask you, please, if you could just answer the questions as short as possible. And the first question goes to Joël, and that is, as Europe delivers weapons to countries and parties involved in conflicts that make people flee their country, how can we present this? Is this a political responsibility? We'd really appreciate your take on this.
Of course, and that's why we have this policy, even a European policy, on exporting weapons to countries that are in risk, that are in conflict. So that's the official line. And then, of course, you have the gray zones, countries that are not directly in conflict, but maybe supporting other countries that are in conflict. If we think about Tigray at the moment, Ethiopia and Eritrea, there's a conflict going on. So if we deliver weapons to Ethiopia, what is happening now in Tigray? So there's a grey zone, and we in Parliament as Christian Union were always trying to keep it very strict, the definition of conflict zones, looking not only to the countries but also to the region where their conflicts are and which countries are involved in that conflict. But there's a big challenge there, because we know France is an exporter of weapons, Germany for a part, and there are big trade-offs in the weapon industry. So even if you have these morals of not delivering weapons, they always find U-turns to deliver the weapons anyway. So I think the politicians should be keen on also these U-turns and do their homework well to check their governments, not to deliver to countries, also not indirectly, if there are situations of conflict.
Thank you very much, Joel. Okay, the next question is for Luc. And Luc, I'm going to ask you to be brief also in your response to this. One development goal of the UN is to eradicate all poverty by 2030. Is that a reasonable goal, or is it highly ambitious, too ambitious maybe?
It is ambitious and reasonable. Why is it reasonable? Because we just ought to. The reason why poverty is man-made, we all know. It's because of inequality, it's because of all the things that we have discussed. So if we bring inequality to term, if we bring corruption to term, if we bring a sustainable investment into play, it is feasible. I think just, and I will give that example, and then just to say, for instance, think about degraded land where people live in Africa. Those lands have so much potential to feed the people if we have the audacity, I would say, to help them invest differently, have access to what is needed to revitalize their land. We are taking them out of poverty and we are empowering them. So it is feasible, it is ambitious, but it is still feasible. But it requires a lot of political will and the understanding that doing that is out of self-understanding of interest.
Luc, thank you very, very much for your answer to that one. Minella, I've got a question for you, and that is the following. What would the world look like if we managed to achieve the long-term solutions mentioned? Because I know that as the director and CEO of an NGO, you also have a vision for the future.
Yes.
And so what would the world look like, and who is the we that we're talking about?
Yeah, that's a good question. The we is the community. And I think in a community, there's a holistic vision. And I think most of the communities are based on virtues. And the virtues I come back to your story, the virtues driven by most faith within a lot of people. That would be my dream, because when you have your vision, your dreams from faith, then you act. I think that's one of the first things which are important, to act on a more justly way from the Western side of the world, and on a more providing way as well. And equally, you have to look and take care for each other. So it's a broad answer, but I think being faith-based in all our actions, being more virtualized in all what we do, could be one step ahead. Yes.
Thank you very much, Minella. Good answer to a very challenging question on that one right there. I'd say a very short question that I can answer very quickly. How is poverty defined in the second presentation? That was mine. The poverty limit is those who live on $1.50 per day, and that's US dollars. Okay, so that one can be answered very, very quickly. I'm going to also just have Lawrence. I've got a question for you. This is a bit of a challenging question also too. What would your thoughts be on if a consortium of developed nations provided the 4 Ps of planning, plumbing, paving, and policing for a city, and then private enterprise can then deliver the jobs and the lifestyle that migrants seek? What's your perspective on that? I'm going to ask for a couple of people's inputs on this. Lawrence?
Yeah, thank you. It's a good question. Thank you for whoever put him forward. Well, I must think first of all of what the staff of NGOs I interviewed said about this kind of large-scale development aid focused on infrastructure. I think on the one side, I think that's the way forward for developing countries, that you need to invest in infrastructure. On the other hand, it's Yeah, it's difficult to. I'm a little bit skeptical, I must say, about the possibility of large-scale Marshall plans, as you can call them, to succeed, and that's for the reasons I mentioned in my presentation. First of all, the funds are lacking, and it's difficult to get everyone in line to support this kind of plans. The second reason is, and I think for me that's the most important one, the rationale of upscaling. I think it's really a rationale that does not. That's not a Christian. It's not a Christian worldview behind it. It's the idea that if you put enough finance in Africa or in developing countries, then automatically you will get progress and prosperity. I see development more as an organic process. And I think that should involve the civil society, churches, enterprises, and that you should really focus on the long term. So I'm a little bit skeptical about this plan.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you very, very much, Lawrence. Just going to ask maybe Luc to weigh in on that really, really quickly, please.
There have been an interruption, so I haven't heard the questions, unfortunately.
All right.
Yeah.
And the question had to do with, if we invest in the 4 Ps in a particular area, planning, plumbing, paving, and policing for cities, then private enterprise can deliver the jobs and lifestyle the migrants seek. Can you give us your comment on that, please, Luc?
Well, as I think it is Lawrence who said it, development is organic. So there's no silver bullet to it. Development has to be contextual and done with people, for people. Remember what Mandela have said, whatever you have been doing for me, without me, you are doing it against me. So yes, it is also important to ensure that when we mean private sector, we mean people as well. So local people, their potential being unleashed to really, and their capacity, their talent being unleashed should be part of what we see as private sector. If this is in the play, then I will concur.
Okay. Thank you very much, Luc. We've got 2 more minutes, and then we will end the question time. I think there's a question here that I'm going to field, and that is, shouldn't we pay a fair price for our coffee, cocoa, and other raw materials, not to exploit or squeeze the people in sub-Saharan Africa? And is our economic system still sustainable? I'll take that one. I have spoken to a number of people, economists, but also, as I said, just a number of ministers of finance from different African countries. And their answer is our economic system still sustainable? No. The current economic system doesn't serve Africa well, but it's not serving the world well any longer. We have switched economic systems. We have switched from the service economy to the digital economy, and that means that we're starting to value different things differently. And so what do I mean with that? Instead of just putting a price on cash or money, capital, a lot of people are starting to now realize that we also have to think of things like human capital, the well-being of individuals, social capital, factors that tend to foster cohesion in communities so that communities can work together, natural capital, which is the environmental factors, in addition to the financial capital. And while some of the emerging areas, I prefer to call them emerging rather than developing, while some of the emerging areas are poor in financial capital, they are very rich in things like social capital and human capital. And studies, and since I lead the Economic Summit, that is always going to be my input on this. Studies from Harvard and Oxford University and INSEAD and all of those places are now showing that just like plants need fertile soil in which to flourish, businesses and enterprise need fertile social capital in which to flourish. And some of these emerging areas are very, very rich in those kind of things. I am going to end with one last question, and then we are going to give the floor to Johannes de Jong, who is representing our sponsor for this meeting. And so the last question that I have goes to, I would just say, I'm going to say, Minella, I'm going to ask you to address the last question, and that is, and it's a question that I'm going to pose, and that is, as director of an NGO, as an NGO that's really quite large, what is your vision for a better future?
My vision is to create more cohesion between different parties. So, like, we know what politics want, but there's far more to catch in Africa. Just to work together with Africa and to see for the benefits of both sides of the world. That's my vision. And then looking to environment, sustainability, and taking care of people on both sides of the world. Yes.
Wonderful. Minella, thank you very, very much. We're now going to move to the closing remarks and closing address, and that will be from Johannes de Jong, and he will be speaking to us in the form of a film. Johannes is a director of SALEX, and SALEX is one of the partners in this migration symposium. Also with regards to funding, SALEX is the think tank of the European Christian political movement. And Johannes has been working for SALEX since its start in 2011. He's been focusing on economy and international relations with a specific attention to those who are quickly overlooked in the global economy and geopolitics. And so, Johannes, we just welcome your closing words.
First of all, I want to thank you as audience for joining us today in this event, Thinking Beyond Moria, on the future, on the current situation and the future of migration and the African-European partnership. I want to thank Wetenschappelijk Instituut of the ChristenUnie, Scientific Institute ChristenUnie, and Economic Summit for their excellent partnership, for their great cooperation, for their work together with us. And thank you so much for organizing and realizing this event. I want to thank the speakers, Luc Gnacadja, Joël Voordewind, Minella van Bergeijk, Arleen Westerhof, and Wijmenga, for their excellent contributions, for their hard work. I want to thank especially Arleen again for also moderating this event. And this event is so important because it is about our shared future, our shared human dignity, our shared challenges, and the need to work together to face these challenges, to have a common future of common human dignity. Africa and Europe can work together for this. And we as Christian organizations can contribute to that. We have such a big role to play. And this event shows that we can play that role and we are contributing. And I hope that this event will encourage and inspire to continue that work. We as SALEX will for sure do so, together with our partners. And if you want to know more about our work, you can simply go to salex.eu and check out our resources, the books, publications, events. And we hope to see you again in a future SALEX event. And again, we thank WI ChristenUnie and Economic Summit for this work and all the speakers for their excellent contributions. And we hope that this will be the starting point, not the end of this process of working together and contributing to the African-EU partnership for helping to create and encourage a more flourishing, prosperous future that serves and is based on human dignity. Thank you.
And thank you for those of you watching at home or wherever you're watching from. On behalf of the Wetenschappelijk Institute, the Scientific Institute of the Christian Union Political Party, and the Economic Summit, we say thank you for choosing to spend your time with us this afternoon. And we hope to see you next time. Bye-bye.